Nearly 40 years after first hitting the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Legend of Zelda franchise is bigger, better, and more epic than ever before. But even with all the advancements over the years, there are a lot of Zelda fans who prefer the simplicity of the early 2D entries, long before the series had you preparing dinner or constructing weirdly suggestive mechs. Pixel Trash is definitely one of those old school fans, as their brand new game Saga of the Moon Priestess is a near carbon copy of 8-bit Zelda. That's a great starting point, but has this up-and-coming developer added enough of its own personality to make this more than just a clone? Well, that's what we're about to find out when I review Saga of the Moon Priestess. When a young prince gets kidnapped by an evil entity, it's up to a young orphan girl named Sarissa to get him back alive. Armed with only a spear and the ability to communicate with the goddess of the moon, Sarissa will need to fight through 5 different dungeons and collect a bunch of useful items in order to free her land from the evil, nameless force that seems to be sweeping in. Look, there's no reason to beat around the bush here. Saga of the Moon Priestess is as close to The Legend of Zelda as you can possibly get without Nintendo suing you into oblivion. This is a game with a very specific nostalgia for the Game Boy Color era of Link's adventure, and longtime fans of the franchise will feel right at home as Sarissa goes through the checklist of cliches. It's a game that changes just enough to be different. You see, you're trying to rescue a prince instead of a princess, and instead of a giant fairy healing our hero, it's a mermaid. See? Totally different. While I poke fun at the obvious influences, there's no denying that Saga of the Moon Priestess does a good job of emulating those early Zelda games. It knows exactly what you want from this type of adventure and delivers it in a short and compact package that never veers too far away from the familiar path. You'll explore a map that's big enough to house a handful of wildly different terrains, but not big enough to where you'll actually get lost. Whether it's the icy mountains, the sandy desert, or the lush forest, each part of the map has its own dungeon to investigate and boss to kill. In true Zelda fashion, you're going to find several useful secondary items that will open up new parts of the map and help you solve some very simple puzzles. The first thing you'll find is a glove that'll allow you to pick up and throw rocks. You'll also find Zelda mainstays like a bow and arrow, bombs, and even a grappling hook. There are also some optional items and upgrades that you can find by just poking around the open world and completing some pretty basic quests for the townspeople. Now, the thing that actually surprised me the most was how short and simple this game is. The art style is designed to evoke the spirit of the Game Boy Color, so maybe it actually makes sense that it isn't an especially deep or involving adventure game. That said, this game is short by even those standards, as a game like Link's Awakening is at least twice as long, with a lot more to do and see. In a lot of ways, Moon Priestess feels like it's just speedrunning through as many tropes and cliches as it can think of, which ultimately leads to a rather anticlimactic ending and a story that doesn't really amount to much. There are, of course, other problems, like the 5 boss battles. Save for a pretty cool final fight at the very end, most of these boss encounters are pedestrian at best. I was genuinely surprised by how easy a couple of them were, and the rest are barely even worth bringing up. I suppose it's nice they have to use your newfound items to defeat each dungeon's boss, but even that is a staple of the Zelda series. On that note, I'm just not a big fan of the combat in this game. The spear is effective enough, I suppose, but it's just not that much fun to play around with. It also jabs instead of swings, which can make it challenging when an enemy is coming at you diagonally. Again, I understand that this is designed to feel like one of those classic adventure games, but even those early Zelda entries have deeper combat than this. In those games, you have a spin attack that you can charge up, and even a projectile that you can shoot if Link's life is full. But all of that is just completely stripped out of this bare-bones retelling. Look, Saga of the Moon Priestess reminds me a lot of a cover song that gets all the notes right, but just doesn't have the heart and soul that made the original so great. Like I said at the top, this is from an up-and-coming developer, so I can't fault Pixel Trash for wanting to sharpen their teeth by essentially remaking a game that inspired them. The problem is that while they came up with a cool new hero, the adventure she goes on lacks anything new or unique. I mean, it's one thing to perform a cover song, but you still need to mix in your own style and your own flavor. In that sense, Moon Priestess is a huge disappointment. At least the game looks the part. If you grew up loving Zelda's Game Boy era, then you're going to appreciate the attention to detail found in every part of this map. I even like the soundtrack and might even make the case that it's the best part of this game. I mean, let's be honest here, it's the only thing about this game that actually feels different from what Nintendo did 30 years ago. I don't know, maybe that nostalgia alone will be enough to keep you invested in this all-too-brief Zelda clone. But I kept waiting for a Saga of the Moon Priestess to find its own voice. Sadly, it never does. There's a fine line between being inspired by a classic game and straight up remaking it. Saga of the Moon Priestess barely hides that it wants to be The Legend of Zelda, which is something that may be nostalgic at first, but ultimately leads us down a disappointing path from one predictable trope to the next, featuring familiar dungeons, cliched locations, and power-ups that you've seen 1,000 times before. There's nothing new or especially interesting here. Couple that with a story that's barely there and an adventure that feels rushed with only 5 dungeons, and what you're left with is a cover song that plays all the right notes, but pales in comparison to the original. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite video game clone? You know what? I'm just gonna let you decide on how to take that question. I honestly can't wait to see what the comments look like. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a brand new Review Crew episode. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.